This is Christology class for Thursday, May the 14th. We're in our final three classes of the semester. This class today, as well as Tuesday and next Thursday, are the final three classes you're going to have before we finish for the summer. I know this year is ending in a way that none of us really expected a few months ago, and we're still taking things as a state, as a country, week to week, trying to figure out what life will look like in the days ahead. For right now, despite the fact that we're not in the classroom together, we're going to do the same thing that we would have done if we were all back at school, is bringing this semester to a conclusion by taking a look back through the course of our school year and our semester. Although theology at times can feel like a smattering of random topics about religion and about Jesus, this entire year and the next few years are all a logical progression, building from the foundations, the most basic principles, what we believe as Christians, and then moving forward into what that means for our lives. So looking back to the course of our year and then looking into the next few years' theology classes. The two classes we had this year were Revelation in the fall and Christology in the spring. For some of us, this was the first time we've ever had a religion class before, after a number of years of public school. For others of us, this is the 9th time we've had a class like this one, after all of our years at Our Lady of Victory or Our Lady of Sorrows and so forth. Each of these two classes is about one fundamental principle each. The fall class, the whole notion of Revelation, is that we believe that God exists, and that he has taken the initiative to speak to the human race, that we're not just coming up with ideas about God when we do theology, but we're actually starting from what God himself has communicated to humanity, that God has in some sense shown himself or made himself known to the human race, and that he has something he wants to say to us even down to the present day. After exploring how God speaks through the church and through the Bible in our fall class, we arrived this spring at the most complete, the most profound revelation that we believe that God made in the course of human history, and that was through his Son, Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, God himself, who became incarnate, who took on the life of a human being, and who taught and revealed all that God sent him to reveal during his life on earth. Again, every class you have going forward in theology, it's not just topics in religion going forward, but every class we have going forward builds from those two basic principles, and especially on our conversation these past few weeks in theology. Especially through the course of the next 2 years of school through sophomore and junior year, the 4 classes that you have are really just the next logical steps you would take in a conversation about this Jesus as God's own Son come to reveal God the Father to us. In the fall, next year, as a sophomore year class is entitled Paschal Mystery, and as a lot of us are already familiar with through that term Paschal Mystery, it's the conviction that Jesus did a lot more than just teach. He didn't just come to pass along a book full of information about religion, but that somehow the most important thing Jesus ever did was his suffering and death and resurrection, those last hours of his life on earth over that Passover 2,000 years ago, that somehow by being crucified and then by overcoming death, and by rising from the dead in his resurrection, somehow those events, we believe, made it possible for the human race to overcome sin and death, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, to the first human beings, the representatives of all of us, whose original sin caused the state of affairs we see around us, the brokenness, the sorrow, the greed, the destruction, the violence. We believe that broken side of the human race is what can be saved, not just by Jesus' wise philosophical sayings, but by his Paschal mystery. And in your class next fall, you'd get the chance to explore all of the implications of that and how it is that we believe that by suffering and dying, that Jesus could somehow benefit us 2,000 years later. Now again, the next logical step is we believe that we don't experience Jesus' salvation just as individuals, just in a relationship we have by saying our prayers and so forth. We experience the benefits of Jesus saving us through the church. So your class after Paschal Mystery, the class you'll have in the spring of next year, is called Ecclesiology, the study of the church itself. That doesn't mean church buildings, that doesn't mean church architecture, that means the study of the church as an institution. And the institution is that collection of people, that body of people, which we believe are saved by Jesus from sin and from death. By the time you get back in the fall of your junior year, your class is entitled Sacraments. How is it that in the church we experience that salvation that Jesus won for us, being saved from sin and death? Again, it's not just through prayers or reading the Bible. In addition to those, we believe that through specific rites and rituals known as sacraments in the life of the church, that God's grace, God's own life, God's own saving power is applied to us, that when we're baptized, which is the first of the sacraments, or when we go to confession, or when we receive the Eucharist, further sacraments, rites and rituals in the life of the church, that God's own power manifests in our lives. It's not just the symbolism of water that's washing away sin, and it's a powerful metaphor and so forth. It's much more than that in the sacraments, which you'll study in the fall of junior year. We believe that it's God's own grace, life, power, and strength, which is passed along to us. Next logical step is, in the spring of junior year, you can have a class called Moral Theology, returning to the number of the topics, the tree we started to bark up a few weeks ago with morality, to experience God's grace through the sacraments, for example, and the other ways that God gives us grace, is to experience their transforming power. We believe that we don't just make an effort of the will to be nice people, but that God gives us the ability to live through his transformation, a different kind of life, a new kind of life. So these are the next 4 classes. The next 4 logical steps you would take in theology, based on everything we believe about Jesus, are the next 4 classes you'll have. Next year will be Paschal Mystery and Ecclesiology. The year after that, as juniors, Sacraments and Moral Theology. Again, you see here a further explanation, just a more complete description of the slides here. The Paschal Mystery is that class on Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. You see below that a question that you might ask in a class like Paschal Mystery, like, how does Jesus dying on a cross save us from sin? Your ecclesiology class and study of the church, well, you could ask, how does somebody become a member of the Catholic Church? Well, through baptism. Can you be unbaptized? Can you leave the Catholic Church? What's the way that the Pope gets elected? Those are all questions that you might find in the broad range of subjects under ecclesiology. Again, junior year, your sacraments and your moral theology class, studying baptism, communion, confirmation, and so forth. You could ask a question like, what if I want to get baptized but I can't? Like if you live on a desert island, do we need to be baptized to go to heaven? Well, what if we want to be baptized but we can't be baptized? Can we still go to heaven? Questions like that. And of course, moral theology, all those questions around right and wrong, God's transformation of our character, both from logic and from the perspective of the church. You could ask the question, for example, in moral theology, when it comes to right and wrong, is it wrong to lie to spare someone's feelings? I think most of us would say it's probably wrong to lie in a court of law or in a Senate Judiciary Committee meeting. But is it wrong to lie if you're trying not to hurt somebody's feelings? Again, that's part of the huge conversation that we call moral theology. By the time you get to senior year, your theology classes are electives, not in the sense that you can take them if you want or find something else to take. They're electives in the sense that you have a few different options as a senior, which direction you might go with the next set of logical questions in theology. And you have got 5 options, at least as it stands right now. Your 5 options as a senior are church history, vocations, Catholic social teaching, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue is the word that's hidden by my face there, and a class called biblical theology. And you see their definitions for each, as well as questions that you might ask in each of those classes. You would take one of those classes in the fall and one of those classes in the spring, and you'd hopefully get some choice then into which class would be your preference, and second choice and third choice as your schedule starts to shake out as a senior. Church history, of course, like any history class, studying the 2,000 years of church history. You might have questions, for example, about the scandal around indulgences 800 years ago. What is an indulgence in the perspective of the church, and why they become such a controversial topic around the time of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation? If you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, church history will shed some light on that. The vocations class, it's questions and the study of what it is to live the life that God calls us to when it comes to marriage, the vocation of being a husband and a father, or the vocation that our Basilian priests and our parish priests have experienced, the call by God to be a priest. How does somebody know if they're being called to be a priest, or if, for a woman, if she's being called to be a nun? Is it possible that some of us here at Catholic Central are called to a life like that? The vocations class explores those different states of life. Catholic social teaching explores the rich history of the Church's moral teachings, not just on individual actions, but on what justice in a society looks like. The Church's perspective and Revelation's teaching on how we are to treat the poor and the homeless, for example, or how we are to fulfill our duties and obligations as citizens. Again, those questions come up in a vivid way from the perspective, once again, of logic and of the Church and its teachings, God's revelation, in the Catholic social teaching class. Ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, to be honest, is the class that I would want to take if I were a senior at Catholic Central. It explores the relationship, number 1, between the Christian church and the rest of major world religions, and secondly, explores the relationship between the Catholic Church in particular and other kinds of Christianity, denominations of Christianity. So what does that mean? Interreligious dialogue, just like the word dialogue and interreligious would indicate, means how does Catholicism relate to Islam or Judaism or Zoroastrianism or Hinduism, or any one of the other major world religions. Ecumenism then means the relationship between Christians in particular. So what do we as Catholics have to say about Lutherans, or about Methodists, or Baptists, or Seventh-day Adventists, or Mormons, and so forth? What do we agree about? What do we disagree about? We can make all kinds of Venn diagrams to see where we overlap and where we diverge. Ecumenism and interreligious dialogue is a semester of exploring those relationships and those questions. Last of all, an option that you have as a senior is to take the biblical theology course. You could say, like, oh yeah, we covered the Bible in the fall. We started to skim the surface of skimming the surface of the Bible in the fall. Again, we could spend months and years continuing to study the Bible and barely put a dent in the depth of what we believe the Bible has to tell us about who God is and about what God wants to say to us. The biblical theology class is a chance then, as a senior, to go back and to explore those questions more deeply. So here's what I'm asking you to do today. There's an attendance assignment. It's available to you already in the MyCC Assignment Center. It's due by 3 p.m. today. You can take a look at that, based really briefly on the first couple slides of this lecture. Your homework assignment is this. I'm looking for 5 complete sentences, 5 questions, which means they should have a subject and a predicate and a question mark at the end. And each of those 5 questions is going to correlate to one of the classes that we've talked about these past few minutes. The first 2 questions have to do with Paschal Mystery and Ecclesiology in sophomore year. The next 2 questions have to do with Sacraments and Moral Theology in junior year. And then you'd pick one of those 5 senior classes I just described and put forward a question about one of those subjects. This is your chance not just to Google questions about the sacraments. It's a chance to look at these subjects, to demonstrate that you understand how these subjects take the next step in the study of theology, and then for you to think about it for a moment and to pose a question of your own that has to do with that subject. You could say, for sacraments, what happens if I lie in the confessional? Are my sins forgiven? You could ask about, moral theology. Why is the church opposed to gay marriage or something like that? Again, I've given you some examples here. There are some further examples in the Google form where you would enter those 5 questions. Of course, all of those examples are off limits to you because they're the examples I give. Again, your job would be to think about those subjects briefly, and then to see if a question comes to mind, or to think long enough until a question comes to mind on each of those 5 subjects. Once again, the 5 subjects are the 4 classes you would have sophomore year and junior year, and then you pick, and you'll see an option on the Google form to do this, one of the senior classes, and articulate a question of your own in that class. So by the time you press the submit button, you've come up with 5 questions that would be perfectly appropriate for you to ask as you arrive at these next few classes: Paschal Mystery, Ecclesiology, Sacraments, Moral Theology, and then whichever one of the senior electives you land on for the fall and then for the spring semester. Again, next week, Tuesday and Thursday, we'll devote some more time to exploring in greater depth some of the subjects we've covered in this class, going back over some of what we've learned, hopefully this semester. Otherwise, guys, good luck on this homework assignment, and we'll see you next Tuesday.